Well, it's a bitterly cold January day, rainy outside, high winds, but here by the fire, it's lovely and warm. Ideal for telling stories. And I've got a beautiful story from the Victor comic for boys. And this dates back to 1966 when, would you believe, England actually won the World Cup. Absolutely full of stories. But the story you're going to hear is the sort of story that really would grace the front page of the Victor comic for boys. Welcome to another tale from the grave. I'm holding a fantastic comic, a comic from my youth called The Victor Comic for Boys, and I'm sure many of you out there would have read this comic many years ago. It was absolutely full of stories, and from a person like myself who loves stories, this comic was a real inspiration. However, the story you're going to hear is the sort of story that really would make a great Victor comic front cover. We're going to turn the clock back now to August 1814 and a conflict between the United States of America and the United Kingdom. Of course, before the year 1780, America was indeed a British colony. However, with the help of the French, America became independent, and of course still is to this very day. Great Britain was deeply upset by losing the colony, and the king was also very upset. America, of course, became independent. She had her own army, her own navy, and she was beginning to flex her muscles. After independence, some 35 years later, American troops actually invaded parts of Canada. You could say they were called incursions, and they set fire to Canadian government buildings. Of course, Canada was indeed, and still is, part of the British Commonwealth. The Canadians weren't happy and the British weren't happy, and Lord Wellington met his senior staff at Horse Guards in London. He met Major General Ross, one of his favourite generals, and Admiral Cockburn. There they organised this incredible invasion by selecting some of the finest regiments in the British Army. You could say the very cream of the British Army. The Royal Scots, the Royal Marines, the Royal Green Jackets and the York and Lancasters. 6,500 very highly skilled and very professional troops. They set off in August 1814 and made their way across the Atlantic Ocean, and there they entered the mouth of the Potomac River. Now the Americans, of course, weren't stupid. They had scouts along the river and information filtered back to Washington of this huge British invasion force. President Madison said, "Don't worry, we know how the British work. They will land and they will wait until the main bulk comes ashore. They'll get their fifes, they'll get their drums, they'll get their orchestras together, and they'll slowly march towards Washington. That's when we get our cannon together and we can annihilate them before they even get off the landing beaches." However, this was the very cream of the British Armed Forces, and Wellington had told Major General Ross, "When you land, don't wait for the main bulk, just go straight towards the enemy lines and burst through them." Well, they landed on the 23rd of August 1814, and the first troops ashore were the Royal Green Jackets, followed by the Royal Marines, and they didn't wait. They made their way straight towards Washington D.C. One Royal Green Jacket officer mentioned in his dispatches many years later, it was really hard trying to keep up with the American defenders who were actually running away. We burst through their defences at the Blandenberg Heights and we found ourselves in Washington D.C. The whole city had been evacuated. President Madison and his staff had evacuated. The city was laid open to the British attackers. One person stayed in the White House, a very, very brave woman, the First Lady, Dolly Madison. She knew that there were some very, very important artifacts inside the building, and she got a knife and she cut away at the canvas of the portrait of George Washington. She rolled the portrait into a scroll and escaped through the back of the building as the first Royal Green Jacket had entered the building. Before long, the whole of the White House was full of senior troops from the invading force, and Major General Ross was quite amazed to find all the tables in the White House had been laid out with the finest table linen. There was hot stew on each table, there was wine on each table, and he told the senior officers, "Right, gentlemen, let's have a meal on the American government." They sat down and enjoyed the finest wines and this beautiful, beautiful, tasty hot pot. After consuming their meal, Major General Ross said, "Right, gentlemen, let's get all the tables together, pile them on top of each other, and set fire to the White House." In the meantime, a Royal Scots officer made his way upstairs into the President's room. He opened drawers and found love letters that had been written by the President. He helped himself to the President's finest clothing and a beautiful silk shirt. These items were later, many, many years ago, in the BBC television show Antiques Roadshow, were going to be resurrected and put on the show itself. Well, they set fire to the White House. The invading force went next door to the congressional buildings, set fire to the congressional buildings, and then they sunk every American warship in the harbour, and then made their way back to the Blandenberg Heights to rejoin the flotilla. The city of Washington was ablaze with fire. One young lady who had retreated into the suburbs watched the glow above Washington, and she hummed a hymn which has gone down in American history as the Star-Spangled Banner. However, the Americans were going to get their revenge, because only a few months later, at the Battle of New Orleans, Major General Ross was going to lose his life whilst trying to take the city. To this very day, of course, the British government and the American government, they don't talk about this because it's embarrassing for both countries, really. Because don't forget, America and Great Britain are allies. We've stood shoulder to shoulder through 2 world wars, for the Korean conflict, for the Iran-Iraq conflicts. Why? Well, we speak the same language and have a lot more in common than perhaps all of Europe put together. However, the story did in fact grace the Victor comic for boys, and has gone on in history as the day the Brits set fire to the White House. To this very day, you can actually go on a guided tour of the White House, and you'll find at the back of the building scorch marks that were left from 1814. A year later, of course, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and in those days, Great Britain was indeed a world superpower. One man that did take place, of course, in that raid was called Thomas Heffernan, a Royal Marine officer who is buried in the West Riding village of Waddington, not too far from where we are now. You could say his story was definitely a tale from the grave.